Welcome back. I'm Berry Craig. Next year will mark the 200th anniversary of the birth of President Abraham Lincoln. But the celebration has already begun. Most historians, well, almost every historian, ranks Lincoln as one of America's greatest presidents. With me today to discuss the great emancipator is Dr. Dave Kreuger, retired professor of history here at the college. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
In assessing presidential greatness, what do historians look at?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure that we can we'd have to give more of an ambiguous answer, because one of these individuals who rated presidents said it's like rating apples and oranges, because the nature of the job of president has changed dramatically. And so when you compare or attempt to compare a Bill Clinton to a James Monroe, well, there might be an affinity there, but when you attempt to make that kind of comparison, the nature of the job has changed. I've been asked by some people, well, what about the qualifications for office of these three candidates we have left, McCain, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton? And I said, I don't know if qualifications mean all that much, because perhaps one of the least qualified candidates for president was Abraham Lincoln. One of the most qualified was his immediate predecessor, James Buchanan, who is ranked as a near failure. So it's a little hard to predict in terms of experience who might make the better presidents.
And of course, much about Lincoln, like great figures in history, is myth and fact. Washington, the famous cherry tree legend, and all of that. I think perhaps one of the things about Lincoln that makes him so endearing is he's the classic story of a poor kid who gets to the very top. Is that part of the Lincoln mystique, or the allure?
That is part of the Lincoln mystique. It's sometimes called the Horatio Alger syndrome, named after a series of popular novels written in the late 19th century about going from rags to riches. This is the idea that anybody can get rich, anybody can make it, although as one cynic said, some of our presidents prove that indeed anybody can be president of the United States. That's part of it. Part of it also, I think, Lincoln presided over a nation that changed from a union of states to a nation. In fact, Lincoln began, increasingly during his term in office, began to use the word nation, and he became the symbol for the American nation and for all of the things that go into the secular kind of national religion. The heroics, the emphasis on military greatness, on the flag, and all of those become deeply entwined with Lincoln, and he became part of the myth. Lincoln was probably much more popular and much more esteemed 30 years after his death than he was during his term of office during the Civil War.
That brings up an interesting point about that. Kentuckians today are astonished at how unpopular this man was in his native state. In 1860, when he ran for president, he polled in the state of Kentucky 1,366 or 1,364 votes, depending on your total. That's less than 1/2 of 1%. In 1864, when he was reelected, he did not carry Kentucky. His lowest percentage of vote came from his home state. Why did Kentuckians not like Honest Abe?
Honest Abe was not a Kentuckian, except by birth and nativity. Lincoln lived 7 years in Kentucky, and his formative experience came really in Illinois. And he became a very prosperous upper middle class lawyer, a member of, well, the frontier urban elite, if you want. Probably what he did carry from Kentucky, carried a couple of things from Kentucky. One was an accent, and trying to determine which Kentucky accent he had is a little tough, but he did carry that. The other thing he might have carried from Kentucky was an aversion to religious fundamentalism, which he found to be too emotional, and that in itself would not endear him to Kentuckians.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the fact that he was a member of an anti-slavery party would not endear him to the heart and mind of Kentuckians as well.
Yeah, that is true. He did not favor the expansion of slavery across the country, although compared to other people in the Midwest at the time, he was pretty conservative on his slavery views. Pretty close to his hero, Henry Clay, oddly enough, who was the Kentuckian. But Henry Clay was a strong nationalist.
Well, Lincoln once said that Clay was always his beau ideal of a statesman.
That indeed is true. Henry Clay believed in colonization of slaves, which was the gradual emancipation of slaves and shipping them out of the country to Liberia. Lincoln held fast to that view down through the early years of the Civil War.
But yet, when Lincoln is elected, the South is fearful that immediately this man will abolish slavery. Therefore, they must secede from the Union. Where does that impression come from?
That impression comes, I think, in part from the statements that were made by a number of the more radical members of the Republican Party, William Seward, Charles Sumner, and others, for example, who were radical abolitionists. Lincoln chose Hannibal Hamlin for his vice presidential candidate. Hamlin was a radical abolitionist. It also came from counting numbers. It was pretty clear by 1860, in fact earlier than that, by 1860, that the South had become really a permanent minority in the nation. It is true that Southerners controlled the Supreme Court and probably controlled the Senate. But Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 without a single Southern vote, without very few votes from slaveholding states. They didn't matter.
Well, in fact, he wasn't even on the ballot in 10 of the future 11 Confederate states.
That is correct. And you know how Kentucky didn't vote for him didn't matter because he had the states north of the Ohio River. And that was a signal probably to more vocal and more radical Southerners that it was time to get out of the Union. Although, to be honest about it, most Southerners did have an attachment to the Union at the time.
Again, going back to this Lincoln myth, there are all sorts of stories about him. Honest Abe, he was called. The famous story of him accidentally shortchanging a man and then walking a long distance to give the man the change. Any truth in that sort of stuff?
Well, there is some truth to that, I think. He was a partner in a general store in New Salem, a little community he lived in Illinois, and the store went bankrupt, and he agreed in the end to pay off the debts that he owed as well as the debts that his deceased partner owed, and he did make good on that. In terms of politics, however, you might want to call him Shrewd Abe rather than Honest Abe.
Right.
But Honest Abe, you looked for slogans at that time. That worked, like rail splitter, meaning the country rustic, which he certainly was not. He was a remarkably well-read man. He didn't have much formal schooling, only a few months. But in this...
Well, now going back to his ideal, Clay, who was a very well-read man, a very sophisticated man, lived in a nice house, he also had that sort of rustic image he wanted to convey to, didn't he? Just one of the fellows.
Just one of the fellows. Henry Clay did that, but Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln did that holding their noses. They belonged to a political party called the Whig Party. Its modern reincarnation is the Republican Party today. A party that really disliked the notion of having to, as they would have put it, pander before the people. That was in pretty sharp contrast to the Democratic Party. They didn't like nominating conventions. They didn't like to have to go out and behold themselves to the people. And I think that was part of Lincoln's attraction to Henry Clay as well.
Interesting. He is born in Kentucky. His family moves to Indiana. He winds up in Illinois, which of course is the land of Lincoln. Became a rather shrewd country lawyer, and then goes into politics because he needs the money?
That indeed is correct. Lincoln's early career could be described as like some college students who drift along in search of a major, except he didn't go to college. He drifted along searching for something to do, and he bumbles into this little community of New Salem. He becomes attached with store owners. There's a few people who'd memorized Shakespeare and read books, and he began to read some of this stuff and became educated. The stores that he worked for went bust, and quite frankly, he needed money. He became a surveyor. He was a part-time postmaster, couldn't scrape enough money together. And then in 1834, he ran for the Illinois legislature because the salary looked good. And he managed to get elected by, quite frankly, avoiding the issues, so he could get as many votes as possible. Once he got elected, he thought, oh my, I'm going to Vandalia. If you've never heard of it, it's not a big deal. It was the capital of Illinois at the time. I better start reading some law books to figure out what they do down there. And so he stumbled into an interest in law, and this is what eventually his reading in law, he continued with it and eventually was admitted to the bar and became a lawyer. He stumbled into it. Mm-hmm. When New Salem, little community, folded, it was a little collection of log cabins, he moved on to Springfield, and there he accidentally bumped into another Kentuckian who was from a rather well-to-do family. His last name was Speed. I think the home still stands in Louisville.
Absolutely.
And they became fast friends, and Speed offered him a bed where he could stay overnight because he was flat broke again. Mm-hmm. And so he bumbles along, and he does become a lawyer. And ultimately became a very successful and a very shrewd lawyer, became the railroad lawyer. Ultimately made his money defending the Illinois Central Railroad and Road Circuit, and became a member of the prosperous middle class in Springfield.
And he marries into a rather prominent Kentucky family. Some of the Todds have migrated to Springfield, and he meets Mary Todd. Talk about that courtship.
He meets Mary Todd, and apparently fell in love with her, but got cold feet. We're not quite certain of the circumstances, and broke off the relationship. Similar episodes had happened with a couple of other women earlier in his life. Anne Rutledge is one of the more famous ones. Fell into depression, went to Kentucky, stayed at Mr. Speed's family's home, came back, married, in the end married Mary Todd Lincoln.
She's bluegrass aristocracy.
She's bluegrass aristocracy. She grew up in what was at the time considered a fine, I think, 14-room mansion. It's on Main Street in Lexington, Kentucky.
It's preserved, isn't it?
It is preserved. You can visit it. Today, it pales in comparison to what I call the trophy houses being built across the country by prosperous people today. But her four sisters were in Springfield, Illinois. She fled Lexington probably for the same reason her sisters did. They had an unhappy experience with their stepmother. But she was well schooled for a woman of her time. And she was interested in politics. She could speak French fluently and used it to her advantage when she lived in the White House. And she was a political companion for Abraham Lincoln. She was also very high-strung. People have speculated on whether or not she was mentally ill at some point in her life, whether she had bipolar disease. She fell into a popular 21st century disease a couple centuries earlier. We can't tell.
But if you look at the poor woman's life, she loses children. Her husband's brains are blown out in front of her. I mean, that would tend to unhinge just about anybody.
That indeed is true. Lincoln was not, emotionally was not very demonstrative. He didn't pay much attention to the children, and she was at her wits' ends because neither one of them believed in disciplining their children. And so it must have, with four young boys in that house, it must have been probably a full-time riot going on all the time.
Right.
He was gone for long periods of time because he had to literally ride circuit as a lawyer to pick up cases and make money for the family. And that caused difficulties, but she loved to entertain. And in Springfield, she once invited 500 people to view their newly remodeled house, and had a dining room that probably could seat 8 comfortably.
Right.
And she enjoyed doing these things on an extravagant scale.
Now, when he's elected president, his really only national political experience is one term as a congressman from Illinois, opposes the Mexican-American War.
That's correct. He served one term in Congress. He was where he got the nickname Spotty Lincoln, because he kept introducing resolutions demanding to know the exact spot on which the first shots had been traded between U.S. and Mexican troops.
Now, explain that. That's very controversial, that whole thing, the Spotty Lincoln. Explain what he meant by that.
But Spotty Lincoln, today there's very little doubt that this was a war of aggression that President James K. Polk had planned. American troops were ordered down to the Rio Grande River, which was not at the time the boundary between Mexico and the United States, but Polk and Texans claimed it. We probably were on literally on Mexican soil. American expeditions did ride out into the countryside. At some point, shots were exchanged. Exactly where and who fired the first shots is not known and was not known then. But it's not unlike the Tonkin Bay episode, which Lyndon Johnson used to claim we'd been attacked by the North Vietnamese. And that brought the United States into a war, and the country was divided over the war. The trouble is, Lincoln got to Congress after the war was underway, and it turned out to be a relatively successful and victorious war. And as oftentimes happens when wars become successful, the public falls in behind them. And so he was in an awkward position there. Other than that, he really had no influence in Congress. He had promised to serve only one term, and he made good on that. And that was the last public office he held until he was elected president in 1860.
And even before that, he loses a very well-publicized Senate contest against Stephen A. Douglas in 1858.
That is correct, and he'd lost an earlier Senate contest in 1855. And so the man had tried twice and had lost.
So never give up.
Never give up. He was ambitious, and in 1860 he thought he was certainly not at all the best qualified man for the job, but he began indirectly to run. He collected clippings, newspaper clippings of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, had them published as a book, which became a bestseller and got his name out in front of people. He had no political associates in the eastern part of the country, in places like Pennsylvania or New York or Massachusetts, where votes were needed. He managed to arrange to give a speech in New York City.
The Cooper Union speech,
at the Cooper Union
very
speech,
famous.
which was a moderate and very, very famous speech. And then, under the guise of having to visit his older son in Massachusetts, made a trip up into Massachusetts, giving more speeches.
Abolition country.
And he, in this way, became known. He gave speeches in Iowa, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, and became known. And he went after the presidency by indirection.
But going into that convention, I think if we could go back and had the Sunday talk shows, the buzz would have been what? Seward would have been the Republican nominee going into that thing?
Would have been Seward. It might have been Salmon P. Chase.
Right. Not Lincoln. He
Bates
would have
of
been
Missouri,
front runner.
but
Right.
not Lincoln.
Right. So how did he pull that off?
He pulled it off because the other candidates were well known, and the Republican Party, like most American political parties, consisted of various wings or factions, and each of these well-known candidates was not liked by other factions. Here was Abraham Lincoln, an unknown. He could be a compromise candidate.
I've seen him referred to as everyone's second choice.
That's true, and he gained the nomination. Interesting man as president, he believed that his major policy was to have no policy. He temporized. He was not aggressive. He generally tended to respond to events. He believed he was controlled by a higher authority sometimes. He used the word God occasionally, but not very often.
It was almost sort of a deistic form.
Almost sort of a deistic form, which he'd picked up in New Salem, believing that there was this impersonal God. But he believed that God controlled events. And so if there is this great slaughter in the Civil War, it must be God's will. So in a sense, he could pass off some of the horrors of that war onto, as he would put it, this divine creator.
And as you point out, he was not an abolitionist, he was a gradualist on slavery. Then along comes the Emancipation Proclamation, which changes the character of the war itself.
That indeed is true. Initially, he argued the war was being fought to preserve the Union. That was the primary goal. And he had said that if he could succeed at that goal by freeing all the slaves or none of the slaves, he would do so. He rarely got out in front of public opinion. In that sense, he's quite similar to Franklin Roosevelt in the Depression and World War II. But public opinion began to change as the war went on and the huge casualty rates rolled in, and it became tougher to get volunteers to fight this war. Congress began to consider passing measures. Slavery began to collapse of its own weight as the Civil War went on in the South. Union commanders in the South oftentimes would declare slaves to be contraband and announce them free when they would conquer or gain control of an area of Tennessee or Virginia. And Lincoln decided it was time to move. Up until 1862, Lincoln believed the best thing to do with the slaves was to purchase with them from their former owners and send them back to Africa. Because quite frankly, Lincoln, like most whites of the time, North and South, did not believe that blacks could compete in a white society. But by 1862, the situation is changing. And so he moves with public opinion and he frees the slaves in areas controlled by the Confederacy, which means he freed no slaves whatsoever. The Confederates controlled them. But as time moved on, he came to see the abolition of slavery as one of the great results of the war. He supported the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. By the end of the war, he allowed that perhaps highly educated blacks and black war veterans probably ought to get the right to vote. So his opinion shifts. And that, in a way that's not surprising. War aims shift and change as the wars go on. And you can see that very clearly in the Iraqi war that we have been involved with. The objective of the war has changed. Objectives have changed over the last 5 years. So he shifted.
In 1864, he runs for re-election and does something very unusual. He chooses a Democrat as his running mate. Why in the world would that man do something like that?
Why would he do something like that? Why he chose Johnson, or if he chose Johnson, is up for grabs. Most people thought he would continue with his first vice president from his first term, a guy by the name of Hannibal Hamlin. But Hamlin had become a member of the radical Republicans who believed in abolishing slavery, punishing Southern whites severely. Lincoln was a moderate. And Lincoln let it be known, he was very good at this, that Hannibal Hamlin was a very good man, but stopped short of saying, I want him for vice president for a second term. And so when the Republican convention met and Lincoln got the nomination, the question is, what do we do? And Lincoln said, let the convention decide. Because Lincoln, in a sense, had said, I don't care who's vice president as long as it's not Hannibal Hamlin. And from Lincoln's point of view, vice presidents don't do anything anyways. Well, so Andrew Johnson won the nomination.
So is it popular, though? 1864, one thing we Americans don't like is long, bloody wars. This thing, 1864, is developing into the bloodiest war America ever fought. You have draft riots in New York. Could it be that the Republicans wanted to broaden their base to bring in these pro-war Democrats like Johnson, who's from Tennessee? Would that have been a motive for this?
Well, it probably would have brought in anti-war Democrats rather than pro-war Democrats. Yeah, Andrew Johnson's from Tennessee, but he supported the Union.
He's the symbol of Southern Union.
The Republican Party in 1864 dropped the name Republican, ran as the Union Party.
Right. So was it then an appeal? Well, you go back to 1860, he wins strictly by appealing in the free states. He has no chance to do anything.
That is correct.
In any slave state. So there are pro-war Democrats in the North, like Johnson, and would this bring them into the party, broaden the base of the party? Because you said they ran as a Union ticket.
I don't know. I think that's problematical because of the Democratic nominee for president in 1864.
Who?
A man that Lincoln said had a notorious case of the slows.
George B. McClellan.
George B. McClellan, who commanded the army around Washington, D.C. and in Northern Virginia for the first time in the war, and failed to move the army, failed to fight. And so Lincoln said he had a bad case of the slows. He eventually dismissed McClellan. McClellan was the Democratic candidate in 1864. And what took the wind out of McClellan and the Democratic Party's sails in 1864 is a magnificent series of victories that the Union Army had won in 1863. Vicksburg, Gettysburg, the Mississippi River was about to be opened. Tennessee, Louisiana are in Union hands.
And Sherman is marching through Georgia.
Sherman is marching through Georgia, and it's clear the North is going to win the war. Lincoln may not. Lincoln feared that he might not get reelected, but he won 55% of the popular vote. That's a landslide.
And then McClellan, of course, one of his problems is there's a strong anti-war plank in that Democratic platform. McClellan
ignored it.
Yeah, exactly, and that's kind of tough to do. So Lincoln wins this reelection. One of the really interesting aspects to me about him is the fact that his wife had all of these rebel in-laws. That's interesting pillow talk there. In the 2 minutes we have left, talk about the personal tragedies that the Lincoln family suffered with their children.
Well, there were a number of tragedies. One is that Mary Todd Lincoln was ostracized by her sisters and her family. They had 4 sons. 2 died before Lincoln's death. A third died after Lincoln had died. So 3 of the 4 sons had been lost. The older son probably tended to be cold and distant from both of his parents. Mary Todd Lincoln had a difficult life. She's accused of being a Confederate sympathizer. In fact, one of her sisters, who'd been married to a Confederate general of all things, did live in the White House for a period of time.
Ben Hardin Helm, absolutely. And didn't the surviving son, he's the one who committed her to the mental institution?
He's the one who committed her, although probably by the time she was committed in the 1870s, her mental state had indeed deteriorated. Rather dramatic.
And again, I've always felt sorry for her because, my God, the loss of these children and your husband.
Yeah, she's a tragic character. It's interesting. She was desperate to have Lincoln reelected in 1864. And you know why? She'd been on a spending binge in New York City buying all these expensive clothes. And if he went out of the White House, the bills would be presented to him. But the shopkeepers wouldn't present the bills as long as he was president. So if he could get it president for another term, she could keep all these extravagant expenses.
And along those lines, we're about out of time. I read somewhere that Mary Todd Lincoln had this thing for kid gloves. She had dozens of pairs of kid gloves, which reminds me of Imelda Marcos and her shoes. So we'll leave that to the psychologist to figure that one out. We're out of time. My guest today was Dr. Dave Kreuger. Our topic was President Abraham Lincoln. I'm Berry Craig, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.